said, I always try to caution people when they hear that not to expect Tolkien when they read my books, because we're very different writers. We're both writing epic fantasy, but he was a man of his times, and I'm a man of a very different times. He was born in the 19th century, a product of the English class system, very educated man, world-class linguist, Oxford Don, spoke Old Norse, Old English, could translate Beowulf, could invent entire languages. In some ways, he was not actually a professional writer so much. He almost did Lord of the Rings as kind of a hobby. And the Silmarillion was really his great work. Of course, he was shaped by his experiences in the trenches of World War I. And all of this helped produce his work. All of it is gristful metal. I, on the other hand, was born in 1948 to a blue-collar family in Bayonne, New Jersey. My father's a longshoreman. I was educated in public schools, and I'm not a world-class linguist. I am weaned on like pulp fiction and science fiction and comic books rather than Beowulf. I like Beowulf, mind you, but I think Spider-Man could take him in a fight. So different people produce different sorts of books. I take the American Tolkien just to mean that they think I'm as good as Tolkien, which is an enormous compliment. Not that I'm writing the same thing as Tolkien, which would be an erroneous and gross misstatement. My work is not remotely like Tolkien's, except in the sense that there are, guys with swords hacking at each other from time to time. Yes?
Can you tell us a little bit about your writing habits? Do you sit down every day at the same time, or just when the mood takes you? Do you have to drink coffee when you're writing?
I sit down every day at more or less the same time. I'm not, super punctual, but basically I get up in the morning and usually I'm at my office by 9 or 9:30, and I do indeed begin with a couple cups of coffee. And the first thing I do is boot up and read all my email. And sometimes there's pressing email that I have to answer. And at some point later, my assistant Ty comes leisurely strolling in, and he sort of sets up a barrier to guard me from phone calls or knock on the door for the rest of the day. And then I switch over to my other computer. I have two computers. I have my PC, my Windows PC, on which I cruise the internet and surf and read blogs and write my own blog and get my email. And then I have my writing computer, which is a DOS machine running WordStar 4.0. And I switch to that when I begin to write my fiction, hopefully in a good, uninterrupted, please don't disturb me period of time. I don't like any interruptions when writing. I like to kind of lose myself in the work and the world. And having that, I get a lot of shit about having that DOS machine, but I am a creature of habit. I continue to believe that WordStar is the optimal word processing system. They haven't improved on it. They've just made it stupider and harder with these newer things. I've occasionally been forced to work on Word, and I hate it. And also, it has the great virtue of being completely separate from the internet. I mean, not only software separate, but hardware separate. It is literally not connected to the internet. So I cannot be hacked. I cannot be infected with any worm or virus or anything. I mean, my Windows machine can and has been. I've gotten viruses. I've lost huge chunks of my email. AOL, I was on AOL for years, and it was like regular as clockwork. Every year and a half or so, the AOL would burp and lose 3,000 emails, which was always kind of annoying but liberating at the same time. Now I was no longer 3,000 emails behind in answer. But I've never lost any of my writing work. It's all there. DOS and WordStar are stable as rocks and immune to any of this crap. So that's a secondary reason. good day, if the writing is going well, I look up and it's dark outside, and my second cup of coffee is still sitting behind me now, ice cold. On a bad day, I'll work for a while, I'll sweat blood, I'll look at what I wrote yesterday and decide it's crap and rewrite it all, and maybe I'll write a paragraph, and then I'll look at the clock and say maybe I should check my email again. If I've gotten some urgent emails, and I'll read my email, and one of them will say, "Hey, did you see this review of your work?" And well, I haven't, so I better go check that review. The internet is a constant distraction there, but I try to keep it at bay. So there are good days, there are bad days. I'm not one of these writers who says I sit down every day and reliably produce 4 pages or 8 pages or 10 pages, whatever it is. I have days where I do produce 10 pages. And those are great days, and I have days where I'm lucky if I can progress a sentence. Or I have other days where I actually lose ground, where I get up and to try to get in the mood, I review the last chapter I wrote for that character, and I actually decide that it's not very good, and I wound up rewriting it all day, or tearing it out, or restructuring it, or going backwards. Again, not an efficient process, but it is mine own, so there it is. Yes?
Hi, do you have any advice for aspiring writers?
Advice for aspiring writers. Well, I have some on my website on frequently asked questions. Um, but just to highlight of them, you should write every day. You should read. An aspiring writer should be a voracious reader, not just of whatever you want to write. I mean, if you want to write fantasy or science fiction, obviously you should read fantasy and science fiction, but you should also read mystery stories and histories and biographies and nonfiction and the classics of English literature, because all of these writers and genres have things to teach you. And the more you learn, the better. And the other big important piece of advice I give is to start with short stories, particularly these days when books like mine are dominating the bestseller lists and things like that. I meet far too many like 19-year-olds who say, "Yes, I'm working on my 7-book series that I'm working on." I go, "Well, what have you published?" "Well, nothing, but I'm working on a series." Yeah, it's like saying, "I'm going to take up rock climbing. I'm going to start with this Mount Everest. I've heard that's a good rock to climb." Yes, it is a good rock to climb, but it's not a good rock to start with. Start with the hill behind your house. Or better yet, one of those little climbing walls that you find in the mall. That's a good place to start your rock climbing. And for a writer, start with short stories, man. I wrote short stories for 6 years before I published my first novel. I had like 50 short stories in print before I completed and sold Dying of the Light. I learned an immense amount. I did some really good short stories. I did some really sucky short stories. I collected hundreds of rejection slips and learned how to take rejection. I dealt with editors. I was able to experiment and try different techniques. Okay, I'll write this short story in first person. I'll write this one in omniscient viewpoint. This one I'll do limited viewpoint. Everybody sooner or later tries to write a second person short story and realizes why it's a sucky idea. And you try different things, and you learn from every experiment. And hopefully you sell some of your short stories, because in science fiction fantasy, we're blessed that we still have a viable market for short stories with places like Analog and Asimov and Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, not to mention all these new e-magazines that are blooming. And you can build your name out there, which is also very good, because then when you do your first novel, it's not, okay, here's a new novel by someone that I've never heard of. Instead it's, oh look, here's the long-awaited first novel by this acclaimed short story writer who's been appearing in all the magazines for the last 3 years. So I think short stories are still the best and optimal way to break in for a new writer in the fields of science fiction and fantasy. You already had a question. Somebody else, yes, you.
Going to the Emmys?
Am I going to the Emmys? I don't know, maybe. I'd like to. We're seeing.
Keep the hat.
The what?
The hat.
The hat, yeah. The hat with my tuxedo and all of that stuff. I went to the Emmys twice, when we were nominated for Beauty and the Beast, which I worked on back in the 80s. Uh, some of you were not born at that time. It's very sad. You're growing old. After Beauty and the Beast went off the air, I used to have attractive young women coming up to me at signings and stuff, and they would say to me, "You work for Beauty and the Beast?" I loved that show. That was my favorite show. It was great. That's very nice. But at some point it changed, and now I have attractive young women coming up to me at signings and saying, "You work for Beauty and the Beast? My mother loved that show." So, the passage of years is passing. Um, but it was fun going to the Emmys in those days. It's black tie event, so you wear a tuxedo and you get a limo, and everybody gets a limo. So you get off the freeway. Your limo driver drives you to the event, and you get off the freeway. And if you're a nominee, I'm talking about, of course, and you wind up in this long line of limos. There's like 300 limos that are creeping forward from the interstate to the venue where the theater where the Emmys are being held, and they're creeping forward one car length at a time because each one is pulling up to the red carpet so that the people in the limo can get out and walk in. And in front of the theater, there's immense crowds of fans, and behind the velvet ropes to keep them away. And they're taking pictures and screaming and squeeing for all of their fans and their favorite actors and performers as they get out of their cars. So when you finally get to the front of the line, at least this was my experience back in the 80s, and you pull up, it's like, here you are, you're at the red carpet, you're at the door, and thousands of people lift their cameras to their eyes and are poised there. And then the writer gets out, and thousands of cameras. Because of course, they're all waiting for a star. But this time it'll be thousands of cell phones, so it'll be a little different from what it was in the 80s. But I don't know. The Emmys are September 18th. I may be going to Reno. I haven't decided yet, but I certainly hope we win. I'm very thrilled that we got the 13 nominations, and that's terrific. I think we're a long shot in Best Drama, but it's so great for a freshman show up against the competition to be judged one of the 6 best dramas on television. The honor really isn't a nomination, and it would be incredibly exciting if we won. I think Peter Dinklage has a real good chance at Best Supporting Actor. So keep your fingers crossed for that, and we should take home a few in the technical categories. Maybe, who knows? Maybe even David Dan for writing, or Tim Van Patten for directing the pilot episode. Although he's up against this Martin Scorsese guy. That could be a tough one, but we shall see. All right, one more question, I think, and then we're done here. All right, you there.
Hey, I have a question about the animals in the series. They play such an important role.
The animals in the
Yeah,
series,
and
yes.
especially like the dogs, the cats, the dragons, everything. Do you have any particular animals that you're especially fond of? Why do they play such an important role? How does that motivate the story? Can you talk a little bit more about it?
Well, the direwolves and the dragons are of particular importance in the series. They're kind of more than animals; they're characters. And I do have a lot of other animals, horses and bears and shadow cats and et cetera, et cetera. But it's the direwolves who are bonded to the Stark children, and the dragons that Danny has, who have a particular role, and they do have a role. They're more than just wolves, and the dragons, of course, have work on a symbolic level. They're symbols as well